a few words of introduction about procedure are due. We would like to kind of get you into the idea of this conference or workshop. When we envisioned it, we were following a format that has been test-driven in this country for quite a while. It's known as Text and Context. It's a workshop that's been going on for almost 15 or 16 years. It's a retreat conference that has been going on for quite a while, every year, which has been a great success. And the format behind Text and Context is that it's a seminar setting. In other words, it's not your run-of-the-mill 20-minute talk, breakneck speed. But on the contrary, we want to bring texts into discussion. We want to discuss text. We want to talk about text and engage text. And for that to happen, in order to facilitate this, what we envisioned is the following format. We have a text presenter in every session, a person who brings forward a text that he will discuss. In this case, it's Yossi Israeli, and I'm going to introduce all three speakers in a moment. We're going to take turns doing that, so you're going to be hearing a lot of me and Ram doing introductions here. But most of what we're going to be doing, and Chaim, and most of what we're going to be doing is discussing text. The text presenter introduces the text, reads it in any fashion form he or she wishes to, and then after about a 40 to 45 minute presentation of the text and mutual reading of the text, we ask two commentators to comment on the text. Briefly, to focus on the text at the center of discussion. These two commentators are limited to about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we open the floor for discussion, for general discussion. That way we have 2-hour sessions. I think they are rich enough, they enable enough space for everyone and to say what they think, to elaborate on the text, and hopefully this will be fertile and for the mutual benefit of everyone.
And also just to add that there's plenty of coffee breaks,
yes,
plenty of time.
Yes. And since these are long sessions, please feel free to get up, grab coffee. The restrooms are around the corner. That's also very important, especially if you're caffeinating all the time. And our first session is entitled The Rabbi and the Friar, a marginal gloss on Genesis 2:3 in a 15th century Bible of Moshe Arachel. The text presenter is Professor Giron, Negron, a professor of comparative literature and Romance languages and literatures and a faculty member of the Committee for the Study of Religion at Harvard University, a specialist in medieval Iberia. He writes and teaches on the cultural interactions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews as gauged from the literary history of Arabic, Hebrew, and Ibero-Romance vernaculars. He's the author of Alfonso de la Torres' Vision Deleitable, Philosophical Rationalization and the Religious Imagination in 15th Century Spain from 2001, and co-author with Laura Minervi of Las Colpas de Yosef, Entre de la Biblia el Midrash, and excuse my Spanish, en la Positia Judo-Española, 2006. He will be the text presenter. The two commentators are our board member and friend Claude Stuczynski, who's associate professor at the Department of General History at Bar-Ilan University, having written a number of contributions in various languages, books. I'll mention The New Christians in Portugal in the 20th century in Hebrew and in French, Between Religion and Religiosity, Converso, Judaizers of Barcelona, of Baranza, and the Inquisition in Coimbra in the 16th century, In Defense of the Nation, Portuguese Converso, Apologetics in the 17th century with Brill, and a long list of other publications. He will be the first commentator. The second commentator is our postdoc, Dr. Yossi Israeli. He's a fellow here at the Center at the Study of Conversion, for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at Ben-Gurion University. He received his PhD from Tel Aviv University, writing his dissertation on the theological and exegetical works of the converted Bishop of Burgos, Pablo de Santa Maria. Just recently, he published a chapter under the title Christianized Sephardic Critique of Rashi's Peshat in Pablo de Santa Maria's editions to the Postilium of Nicolaus de Lira, in a volume on medieval exegesis and religious difference, edited by Ryan Speech. So I hand over the microphone to Professor Luis Giron of Harvard. Please.
I guess anyone can hear me clearly, no? Well, thank you for the hospitality. And I should be quivering under the honor of responsibility to open this, but I am too jet lagged to notice. So instead, first, I brought some ancillary materials. There are only 15 copies, so do share. I'm just going, you can use that as some reference materials for my presentation of the text. I wrote something written so that I don't wander, because I realized I was going to be too sleepy to just extemporize. And I'll try to do three things briefly. A, to say something about the Old Spanish Bibles. B, to say something about the Arrayel Bible, whose excerpt is included in this booklet. And thirdly, then I'll present the text. This is work in progress. It's part of this collaborative effort with two dear colleagues from Spain and my late friend Angel Sainz Vadillos. We've been working on the Arrayel Bible for a number of years. We have a lot of questions, a lot of unsolved problems. So I welcome suggestions, corrections. Please send them my way, because it's going to take at least 10 years to produce. We are still in Genesis. We have 1,320 pages of materials just for Genesis and the prologue. So we do have a way to go. So let me say something about the text, and first find this here. It's a lovely format. Okay. Here we go. And do forgive also, I mean, it was an improvised English translation that could be much improved. So, first something about the Old Spanish Bibles. No single translation of the Bible has played a comparable role in the literary history of Spanish to that of the King James Bible in English or Luther's Bible in German. And yet, the medieval Spanish Bibles, as an unified corpus, tell a fascinating story. There are more extant translations of the Bible into Old Spanish than into almost any other pre-modern European vernacular. Old and Middle English, Anglo-Norman, Old French, Middle Hochdeutsch, Old Church Slavonic. The surviving manuscripts that contain these translations are but a handful, with too many casualties to the ravages of time and the inquisitorial bonfires of the 16th century. Their sheer number and chronological range, spanning over 3 centuries prior to the humanist Bibles of the Protestant Reformation, point, though, to their formative impact, or at least their significance within Iberian cultural history. Now, the nature and raison d'être of these Iberian romanciamientos have no perfect parallels either elsewhere across the Pyrenees. A couple of the surviving Old Spanish Bibles were, like their other European counterparts, vernacular translations of Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Indeed, the medieval vernacular Bibles from Western Europe are almost exclusively New Testaments translated from Jerome's version. Most of the other Old Spanish romanciamientos were, however, translations of the Hebrew Bible made by Jews from the original Hebrew and Aramaic. The manuscripts that have preserved them are written in Latin script. They were prepared, adapted for use by Christians who claim to value the Veritas Hebraica. But the texts themselves originated, it seems, in a Hispano-Jewish tradition of vernacular Bible translations, which in turn may have been at least partly influenced by an earlier Judeo-Arabic tradition going back to Saadia. Or at least that's the claim of my teacher, Bernard Septimus, who has a sustained interest in these Bibles because of his efforts to look at traces of the oral transmission of Saadia in this corpus. The crowning jewel among the Old Spanish Bibles, a text which, as I mentioned, I'm co-editing, and the immediate backdrop to my intervention in this workshop, is an illuminated codex of the entire Hebrew Bible, translated and annotated by the 15th century Spanish Jewish scholar Moshe Arrayel of Guadalajara, La Biblia de Arrayel, the only perhaps one of the only Jewish biblical translations from the Middle Ages in an European vernacular, at least commented translation, and a strange avis rara among the medieval biblical translations. Now, why did I choose this particular selection for from Aradiel's Bible for our workshop, and a workshop on religious conversion? Well, the overarching topic for today's workshop provides a fruitful angle through which to analyze one distinguishing feature of this biblical romanciamiento that I have been wrestling with as an editor in the past couple of years. The Aradiel Bible, both as a literary artifact and as a historical source on Jewish-Christian relations, is not only the product of this collaboration in 15th century Spain. It stands out, among other things, for the variety of Christian materials that are shoehorned by mendicant friars, both in the translation itself and in the Jewish exegetical glosses of the rabbinic translator. There are Christian interventions, both textual and visual, and they come in the way they interrupt the Aradiel's efforts at weaving an exposition of rabbinic exegesis within his philosophical frame for the benefit of his patron. Some of these interventions reflect Aradiel's rare collaboration with a Christian friar in the joint production of the Codex, and their interesting commitment to putting side by side Jewish and Christian biblical interpretations. And there are a couple of examples in one of the handouts if you have the time to look at them. There is at least one example where Aradiel contrasts his own translation of the Hebrew with Giron's, and there is another where Aradiel and Fray Arias provide competing interpretations of a notorious episode in Abraham's story based respectively on Nachmanides and Augustine. However, some of the interpolations rather reflect a more aggressive involvement on the part of the Christians responsible for the collation of Aradiel's writings and the material creation of the final codex. There are selective interpolations in the Aradiel materials made a posteriori and rooted in the conversionary efforts of Christian anti-Jewish apologists that were not happy with the efforts of fellow Christians in concert with Aradiel. The gloss that I asked you to read, the gloss that I provided, it offers a particular template for a historical typology of conversion, and we'll get to. And one of the issues that I'm trying to sort out, and I don't have an uniform answer for it, is how to assess the various Christian interventions in the Codex. Some cases, Aradiel gets materials from the friar and he includes them in the gloss. Other times, the materials were incorporated during the production of the Codex when Aradiel was no longer involved. Just sifting out who is already quite a puzzle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Aradiel's Bible offers a rare case study on a historical taxonomy of 15th century models for Jewish-Christian interaction, a taxology of encounter that profoundly shaped the complex production of this Old Spanish Codex as tried the Jewish and Christian worlds. Let me say something briefly for those who are not familiar with Aradiel about the Codex itself, and then we can just plunge right into the text. Don Luis de Guzman, a prominent Castilian aristocrat, he was the Grand Master of the Military Order of Calatrava, contacted Rabbi Moshe Aradiel in 1422 to commission a translation of the entire Hebrew Bible into Spanish, accompanied by a full exegetical commentary. The Hispano-Christian nobleman had expressed a particular interest in how Jews interpreted the Bible, especially the late medieval Jewish commentaries not represented among the rabbinic authorities selectively used by the Franciscan Nicholas of Lyra in his influential Postilla. As many of you will know, the 14th century Franciscan scholar wrote a series of commentaries on the Latin Bible, noteworthy for their selective engagement with Rashi, one of the first Christian Hebrides in the history of medieval Christian biblical interpretation to do so. Lyra's glosses on the Latin Vulgate were the subject of intense debate in Arrayel, Spain. For example, Pablo de Santa Maria, and we'll be talking about him, Arrayel's contemporary, had produced a series of sharply worded addiciones tullidas postilae centered on his maladroit recourse to Rashi and his putative insufficiencies as a Christian, he writes. Anyway, my dear namesake, Luis de Guzman, was aware of Liras Postilae and Pablo's addiciones, which he adduced to justify his putative interest in Jewish exegesis and the concomitant desire to have Arrayel prepare a commented translation of the Hebrew Bible. Arrayel, however, had serious misgivings. He declined the commission at first in a letter that is preserved in the prologue, going beyond the expected exercise in captatio benevolentiae. Arrayel was hesitant, genuinely hesitant about the scope of his patron's interest in and receptivity to rabbinic exegesis. Now, Arrayel is writing less than 8 years after the calamitous anti-Jewish Tortosa disputations of 1413, 1414. He also professed some personal scruples over his potential involvement in creating a biblical codex with illustrations. However, Luis de Guzman insisted. He was very persistent. Indeed, he didn't give him much of a choice, assuring him that there was no need to self-censor in his serial exposition of Jewish biblical interpretation. He promised, furthermore, to send 2 mendicant friars, a Franciscan, Arias de Encina, a Bible scholar, and a Dominican, Juan de Zamora, to provide Christian addenda to the glosses and assist with the process, which I don't think assuaged his fears, but he continued. So the rabbi, the knight, and the friar debated, but the friar insisted, the knight prevailed, and the rabbi complied. Arrayel devoted 8 years to a full commented translation of the Hebrew Bible. He began in 1422 and finished a complete draft in 1430. This magnificent codex, which was probably executed a year and a half after Arrayel submitted the last quire, around 1431 most likely, contained the full translation, revised by the friars, along with 324 Bible illustrations and over 6,327 exegetical glosses, many of considerable length, complexity, and encyclopedic detail. That's why I'm still in Genesis. Indeed, I mean, actually, at least 1/3 of the glosses are in the Pentateuch, and half of them in Genesis and Deuteronomy. So this was one of the more complicated parts of the project, just getting started. The exegetical postilae by Arrayel were drawn from a vast range of rabbinic and medieval Jewish commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, classical Midrashim, medieval Andalusian and Franco-Jewish exegesis, I mean, Rashi, Ben Ezra, Nachmanides, Kinhi, Nisim of Barcelona, Hiskeni, Gersonides, Tur, they all appear at different points, even just in Genesis. Maimonides' rationalist interpretation of biblical pericles in an allegorical key, and so on. These glosses showcase Arrayel's considerable erudition, his exegetical formamentis as a Hispano-Jewish intellectual. He's not an original thinker. I am not making any claims about his particular genius or lack thereof, but he certainly covered a wide range of sources to impress, to put together this commentary. They are all pressed to service for the benefit of both his Christian addressee and his imagined audience of Hispano-Jewish eavesdroppers. It was a superb introduction to the diversity of exegetical traditions in Jewish biblical scholarship at the end of the late Middle Ages. But, and here comes again the Christian interventions, there were also patristic exegetical materials selectively embedded in his glosses, either by his Christian collaborators or else by Arrayel himself at the latter's behest, on the more sensitive areas of theological divergence between Christians and Jews. Now, these Christian interventions include both intra and interlinear additions from the Latin Vulgate, lengthy theological excursa on Christian dogma, interpolated centos of New Testamental passages, hybrid mixes of Jewish and Christian glosses, and alternative commentarial notes from Augustine, Giron, Nicholas of Lyra, etc. So again, a taxonomy of Christological interruptions within the textual body of Arrayel's translation and the rabbinic glosses on the entire Hebrew Bible. The illuminations, I mean, these illuminated miniatures were partly inspired by a lost biblical codex from the Cathedral of Toledo. It also conflated, at least a third of them, conflated Jewish and Christian readings of biblical passages with certain syncretistic abandon in a visual repertoire that is exceedingly rare in medieval biblical iconography. The translation itself, for those who can read Spanish, I mean, I just provided an example of the gloss, but the translation itself is a wonderful literary artifact for Ibero-Romance philologists. As a translation from the original Hebrew and Aramaic, Arrayel's romanciamiento is systematically inflected by Jewish biblical interpretations and partly compatible to the other Hispano-Jewish Bibles whose Hebraizing style adumbrates the Judeo-Romance koine of the Sephardic diaspora. However, its felicitous translation choices and periphrastic expansion sometimes iron over the stylistic wrinkles of the more literal versions with intelligence and some aplomb. There is at times even literary finesse, and in the glosses sometimes, especially when he's paraphrasing certain rabbinic agadot, some proto-modelistic aspirations. The Christian interventions, on the other hand, set out the Vulgate as a looming shadow over the philological integrity of Arrayel's efforts in translating from Hebrew. So in sum, we have this wonderful text, deeply learned work of pre-modern Hispano-Jewish scholarship, a luxurious cultural artifact of art historical value, a substantive work of all Spanish literature, and this very intriguing historical source on the complex relations between Jews and Christians in the first half of the 15th century. Now, we are very fortunate that this survived. We are very lucky that this survived. Arrayel's autograph quires are lost. There is only a most rare indirect witness to the original materials provided by Arrayel. Luis de Guzman was not at his court when the final product was delivered. And the codex itself, and we only know one copy, had a somewhat complicated history with several lacunae that I cannot expound in any detail. Suffices to say that the Arrayel Bible was documented in the treasury of Henry IV of Castile in Segovia, also in the inventory of Queen Isabel la Católica's personal chambers in the late 15th century. I mean, the inventory of the Repostero de Cama includes an explicit mention of this codex. The codex disappeared from view throughout the 1500s, and it reappeared at the beginning of the 17th century, jumping back and forth like a hot potato between the hands of Jesuit and Carmelite readers, a Grand Inquisitor, and a couple of prominent aristocrats in Valladolid and Madrid, all within the span of a decade. After another disappearance act of several decades, it finally landed in the house of the Duke of Alba in 1688. They're putative custodians to this day in the Palacio de Liria in Madrid. I still haven't a chance to go and talk to the heir of the late Duchess of Alba. I had the distinctive pleasure not to meet her, so I'm very happy. I hope that I'll be fortunate enough to lay my hands on the actual codex, now that either her son or her grandson is the official custodian of their cultural heritage. So we are fortunate it survived. Now, I think it's time to go to the text. I usually, when I make presentations about the Arrayel Bible, I center on Arrayel himself. Usually most of my presentations are about Arrayel as a translator, as an old Spanish writer, as a biblical exegete, as a Jewish scholar, or about the codex itself. But the gloss that I sent to you, let me just say, introduce it briefly, and then we can have a conversation. Now, I think it provides enough fodder for thought about our discussion. And the Lord blessed the seventh day and sanctified Genesis. So the biblical lemma of Arrayel's gloss, and keeping in mind that this codex has the biblical translation completely enveloped by the glosses provided. And every page was carefully orchestrated by the artisans of the final product. I mean, they left space to ensure that all the glosses will be fully incorporated, with left space for the illustrations. So, and the Lord blessed the seventh day and sanctified. Vayevarech Elohim et Yom HaShevi'i vayekadesh oto. Now, Arrayel's gloss has at least 4 distinct parts. I've divided it in the divisions. Those numbers, those 6 numbers, are the ones that we are using in the edition for the sake of the annotation. But we can talk about at least 4 distinctive parts. The first part conforms to what we would expect from Arrayel's take on Luis de Guzman's original commission. Arrayel offers therein a succinct overview of Jewish exegetical positions on this biblical verse, presumably for his patron's benefit. At some points, he actually addresses Luis de Guzman in the glosses. I mean, Don Luis, this is what you say about this particular verse. Don Luis, you may not like this, but this is what you think. Don Luis, muy alto Don Luis. I feel this way, I will not. A master class on Jewish exegesis for the benefit of Luis de Guzman. What a lovely name. Now, in the first portion, Arrayel shows 3 classical commentaries, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Kimhi with a little Saadia, in order to showcase how some Jewish scholars understood one of the interpretive issues raised by the biblical proof text, the meaning ad locum of the verse for blessing and sanctification. So, for example, to bless this day means that an omer of manna, almud. I love that he used the word. Still in Puerto Rico, we use almud, for coffee measurements, but never seen it in old Spanish text until now. Was provided per head, and on Fridays, a double ration. So here we have Rashi with Bereshit Rabbah, who Rashi interprets both the blessing and the sanctification of the seventh day as a future reference to manna, how God would provide each Israelite with an omer of manna a day, the blessing, and with a double ration on Fridays to hallow the Shabbat, his sanctification. Now, Arrayel applies Rashi's interpretation of both divine actions to the blessing only. And this interpretation is quoted by other sources that Arrayel also perused. It's quoted by Kimhi, Tur, Nachmanides. Then the second one, others say that the blessing falls upon those who observe it. No, sanctification means that no work would be done on that day. That tiny line, is basically a verbatim translation of a portion of Ibn Ezra's gloss ad locum, i.e. the sanctification. And by the way, in those who have the handout, you can look at all of the Hebrew text if you want to compare it to the Spanish or the English. The sanctification of the Shabbat means that no work would be done on that day. Nachmanides quotes as well Ibn Ezra on sanctification. Then the third one, the third passage, where he goes, others say that the blessing falls upon those who observe the Shabbat, for the Lord will bless them, and said blessing will be on their souls. That is, the soul itself will gain in virtue once these men leave behind their worldly thoughts, meditating on God, studying, praying, listening to sermons about Him. The soul undoubtedly becomes holy, and thus the Lord our God bestows His blessing upon him. Know that the law refers to all feasts as Shabbat, so they must be observed in full as if they were the Shabbat itself. Now the passage opens with Saadia's interpretation as quoted by Ibn Ezra, also appears in Tur, i.e. that the blessing and the sanctity of the Shabbat falls upon those who observe it. Then Arrayel's evocative reflection on what the observance of the Shabbat entails, a day of prayer, a study, meditation on God, builds upon his explication, Tashe Beitza 16a, of the sabbatical blessing as an increase in the soul's well-being, Betobat Hanefesh, a phrase which almost certainly lies behind Arrayel's La bendición que así haberían animal la ponen. So animal in the etymological sense of soul-related. The added caveat on the observance of all Jewish holidays in relation to the Shabbat is not from any of the sources. It seems to be perhaps Aragel's flourish. Again, if you have any sources to provide, let me know, because we'll be very grateful. Now, so at this point, he's reviewed 3 basic interpretations of the verse. There are other interpretations that Arayel clearly knew, but chose to skip. For example, Nachmanides himself explains the Shabbat's blessing as the source of all blessings, and its sanctification as the sanctity drawn from the heavenly temple. He deems both explanations related to the esoteric meaning of Bereshit Rabbah 11:9. Or then, according to Ben Ezra, the benefit, the blessing, could also refer to an increase in well-being for both the body's reproductive strength and the soul's intellectual capacities. However, at this point, Arayel has provided just a sample of 3 rabbinic interpretations, and he steps back. Having offered this range of Jewish takes, he incorporates Fray Arias materials. And again, usually the way that it works, I mean, that Fray Arias, Arayel would provide materials, Fray Arias would look at them, he would provide Christian materials and indications of where to add them, and then they would be added in different forms. And there is a typology of ways in which Arayel incorporates these materials. In this case, I mean, there is an inserted Christian gloss based on the Vulgate version of this verse, which is the second part of the text. This Christian addendum is highlighted in the codex by a red cross placed right next to it. This is the very first, so the crosses that you see in the translation actually reflect how they highlighted in the manuscript these Christian interpolations. So one of the things that intrigues me, sometimes they use the crosses, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have interpolations with no crosses. I haven't found any crosses without interpolation so far. So. But in this case, is basically a visual indicator that a Christian portion has been inserted. Now, this particular text, note as well that Scripture could say in here, on the 7th day, the Lord finished the work that he had been doing and no longer mentioned God or referred to him, yet we see that Scripture says the Lord finished, the Lord made, the Lord created, which means that what the Father finished, the Son finished, and the Holy Spirit finished. What the Father made, the Son made, and the Holy Spirit made. What the Father created, the Son created, and the Holy Spirit created. It is all one essence, for God is mentioned 3 times in here, signifying the Trinity. So,
very clear.
Huh?
Obvious.
Absolutely obvious. It's a Trinitarian interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3 that associates each of the 3 verbs depicting divine actions with each person of the Trinity. Cumplió el Señor, completed quod Deus, with the Father. Fizo el Señor, quod fecerat with the Son. And crió el Señor, quod creavit Deus, with the Holy Spirit. So you have, I mean, your run-of-the-mill Christological addition. Completit Deus die septimo opus sum, quod fecerat, et requievit die septimo universo opere quod patrarat, et benedictit die septimo, et sanctificavit illum quae in ipso cesaverat ad omni opere suo, quod creavit Deus faceret. Now, this intervention is very much in line with the basic modus operandi of the day-to-day collaboration between the rabbi and the friar. So this is the more typical example of a joint apostilla, where you have Jewish materials and the friar provides a Christian material, and they are set side by side. He said, she said. It tends to be the least intrusive, I mean, in the sense that they are, explicitly acknowledged. This is Christian, this is Jewish. And yet, Arayel does not stop here. Obviously, provoked by the particular way in which the friar interpreted the 3 verbs, he provides a counter Jewish explanation of the 3 verbs. And this one represents yet another facet of Arayel's intellectual profile, which is his basic predilection for a Maimonidean approach to biblical esoterica. Throughout his commentary, Arayel, at least in the section that I've been studying so far, he reviews, obviously, a full range of rabbinic approaches to exegesis, but in selected occasions, he shows a decided preference for philosophical allegories and rationalistic interpretations of both biblical visions and Rabbinic Aggadot as figurative, not literal. Y esta visión no es literal, como dice Moisés de Egipto. That's one of the leitmotifs you find in many of the discussions. Here we have a typical example. Now, I'm not going to read this in detail. You can actually read through it and then we can come back to it. But what he does, basically he says, there are three divine actions depicted in Genesis 2 to 3. What God finished, Vayechal Elohim, the work that God ceased to perform, Vayishbot Bayom HaShevi'i Mikol Melachto Asher Asa, and what God had created in order to do, Asher Bara Elohim La'asot. Now, Arayel matches these three actions with three different levels of creation, three worlds. The first one with the angels, which are, he says, fully created ab initio in their absolute immutability. The second with the heavenly spheres, not as perfect as the angels, they only experience some change in motion. And the last one with the world of generation and corruption, the sublunary realm of all living creatures, recreated and renewed day after day. The Hebrew lasot, to do, is thus explained as neither in the past nor in the future tense, but rather indicating the continuous present of nature's constant remaking. Now, Arayel's interpretation has an impressionistic resemblance with Gersonides' exegesis, for whom God's desiring of the world, his interpretation of the Hebrew Vayechal, brings about the desire of the separate intellects to move the heavenly spheres, and their rotation in turn brings about the perpetual sustenance of all the other existing things. However, Arayel's interpretation of Lasot is more restrictive than Gersonides. You can actually check Gersonides also in Jehanna for those who want to look at it. For whom it encompasses the continuous sustenance of the entire universe. So at this point, Arayel's particular source, if there be one, eludes me. Again, any experts on Jewish philosophical sources, your insight is more than welcome. Because, I mean, even Bernard Septimus, who is, we say in Spanish, un pozo de sabiduría, he's still looking for one. So at least it makes me feel good. If he hasn't found one, it means that it takes some effort. So what do we have so far? And yes, I have been mindful of time. Three typical examples of rabbinic exegesis: a Christian contribution by the Franciscan interlocutor, Arayel's riposte with an allegorical interpretation in a philosophical spirit. But these three give way to the pièce de résistance. The last and longest section, and again we can go back to it, but if I read it now, I will take up the entire hour. We can go back to this text, the one that begins, know that the deeds the Lord our God accomplished of those 6 days signify not only those particular works which as Scripture says he performed therein, but also what was bound to happen in the world. And then there is the cross, but you know what to expect. Arayel's gloss closes with a substantive passage from a Jewish exegetical source quoted in extenso, yet selectively modified throughout by Christian interpolators. Before I discuss, because this is the most significant part for our discussion, it's not clear to me at what stage the interpolations were made. This is one of the questions to decide. Did Arayel receive these materials from Arias to put in? Or did the Christian interpolators add it? I'm inclined to think that it happened after Arayel's intervention. But I am not sure. Usually Arayel is, he tends to be more deliberate in framing the presentations of Christian materials when he's the one bringing in like Arias' text. Whereas here, this is certainly someone who made a point of adding Christian things throughout this lengthy passage. And it's done in a way that is not what I have found so far in Arayel. Again, I'm basically based on my reading of Genesis so far. Now, the underlying Jewish text is Nachmanides' famous hexameral interpretation of world's history, also quoted in Tur, which maps each of the 6 days of creation with a 1,000 years period. Day 1, Adam's millennium. Day 2, the time of Noah and the flood. Day 3, the time of Abraham through the Torah's reception at Sinai and the building of the first temple. Day 4, the time that ranges from Babylonian captivity until 172 years after the destruction of the second temple. Day 5, the plight of the Jews under Gentile rule in the Christian era. Day 6, the plight of the Jews under the rise of Islam with the Messiah's arrival in visions. Day 7, the Messianic age, the world to come, the eschatological Shabbat. Now what surprises me here is the full range of Christian additions interwoven in the textual fabric of what I presume to be Arayel's original Nachmanidian excursus. I may be wrong, but you have the way that Nachmanides is presented and the additions. Some of them are marked by a cross, others are not. So, for example, this is, the important thing, this is not a Christian interpretation set side by side with a Jewish commentary in clearly demarcated spaces for dialogue, encounter, what have you, but a rather meticulous Christianization of Nachmanides' historical scheme. So we have a Jewish template converted into a Christian eschatological narrative. So what are the main Christian addenda to the Nachmanidian scheme? Well, A, you have the recasting of his introduction as a historical overview encompassing both the Old and the New laws, which is marked by the cross, and to the law, new and old, and to the Messiah, and how all laws will become one. Another insertion, the insertion of the Messiah's nativity in the 4th millennium, with accompanying reference to the forgiveness of original sin. So we can take for granted that a Christian addition. The eclipse of the heavenly lights, signaling the fall of the second temple in Nachmanides' text, gives way to the light of the Messiah's birth, symbolized by the stars. And this interpolation is also marked by a cross, which I think I put in there. C, the Roman persecution of Christian martyrs under Nero and his successors replaces the plight of Jews in the Gentile nations in the 5th millennium. D, 4th, the apocalyptic drama of the 6th millennium is recast as the rise of the Antichrist and his defeat after Christ's second coming, heralded by Elijah and the saints, with the subsequent conversion of all nations. E, the evocation of eschatological times now centers on universal bodily resurrection and the final judgment, when those safe among the living and the resurrected will enjoy, like the angels, the fullness of the beatific vision, unencumbered by bodily appetites. Now, these are the 5 main interventions. There are other minor alterations which may be compatible with Jewish sensibilities, yet potentially reflective as well of a Christian intervention. So instead of knowledge of God eternal, Abraham in here teaches faith. There is a verbatim translation of Nachmanides on the commandments. Entonces se cumplieron todos los mandamientos de la ley, los cuales el fruto del mundo ellos son. But then it is completed with a soteriological flourish, para la vida eterna ganar. There are as well garbled portions of the Spanish, whose meaning can only be elucidated by the Nachmanidian source. Again, this is one of the possible indicators that it happens after Arayel, because Arayel obviously knows the Nachmanidian text. So, I mean, these mistakes, I'm inclined to think that are produced when the Christian censors try to fumble with the text. So, for example, when it says, en el cuarto millar el templo de Dios edificado fue, digo, el templo primero 72 años hasta el templo segundo. In the 4th millennium, God's temple was built, that is, beginning 72 years after the first temple until 172 years after the second temple. Well, Nachmanides' point is that the 4th day of creation began 72 years after the first temple was built and ended 172 years after the destruction of the second temple. Now, is Arayel responsible for this? Are these later editorial interventions? It is not always clear, but I suspect that Arayel first summarized in Spanish Nachmanides' take in the context of the original gloss, and perhaps after he handed over the pertinent quires with his autograph materials on Genesis, the Christian censors felt this particular text offered an irresistible opportunity to engage in an apologetic rewriting of a Jewish eschatological reflection. Either that, or Aradiel was forced to put them where they were put. Which, again, is not out of the question, but it's not the typical gesture found in the other glosses where Christian materials are added. That's what I put an interrogation mark. Either way, this is significant. Now, the hexameral representation of human history as a week of ages mapped onto the 6 days of creation, followed by a sabbatical rest, that already enjoyed a rich theological faith in Christian apocalypticism. There are diverse iterations of this millennial scheme, for example, in Augustine's work, the Trinitate, in the Confessions, the Civitate Dei. The Christian scholars involved in the Aradiel Codex were almost certainly acquainted with these patristic traditions. Augustine, again, is one of their main sources in the early glosses. Moreover, the Franciscan friar must have been particularly familiar with alternative historical schemata for Christian eschatology, such as the Joachimite theory of the three ages, so deeply popular among the spiritual Franciscans in 15th century Castile. Joachim de Fiore's historical theology was a contemporary subject of debate in the internecine struggles between conventional and spiritual Franciscans. Eventually, the spirituals would prevail with Cisneros' support in the second half of the 15th century. However, instead of replacing Nachmanides' text with a Christian alternative, and they could have done that, sometimes other things happen, instead of replacing it or setting side by side Jewish and Christian versions of these eschatological narratives, the central themes of the Christian Heilgeschichte were grafted by Aradiel's ecclesiastical overseers onto the hexameral frame of the Jewish polymath. A polemical sensibility prevailed over the more semi-dialogic engagement reflected in Aradiel's incorporation of the Christian materials provided by Fray Arias elsewhere in Genesis. So what can I say? And this is my very brief conclusion. 45 minutes almost to the, I hope, to the second. What can I say? In a recent monograph, Conversion and Narrative, Ryan's speech expertly reconnoiters a wide range of Ibero-medieval conversion narratives embedded in polemical texts that showcase, according to him, two literary paradigms on the Hispano-Christian side. He talks about, on the one hand, conversion as a narrative reenactment of sacred history, the Christian Heilgeschichte, and also about conversion as intellectual acquiescence to Christian authority via disputation. His first case illustrates, for example, how a Christian theology of Judaism is typologically reenacted as an Augustinian conversion narrative of Pauline roots with its attendant hagiographic conventions in Pablo de Santa Maria's autobiographical introduction to his 15th century Ediciones. Early on, Ryan states, and I quote, medieval, polemical, this was my effort to tie to the topic of conversion. I did this just before I came in at midnight. I said I need to bring something more explicit. So, and Ryan is a good friend, so I got my hat to him. This happened just the night before I flew here. Medieval polemical conversion narratives, especially in Christian treatises, can be seen as a form of learned discourse dedicated specifically to the allegorical expression of a theological vision of soteriological and ecclesiastical history, of salvation history or Heilgeschichte, end of quote. I would surmise that this Christian paraphrase, probably a posteriori, of Aradiel's précis on Nachmanides' gloss, was envisioned as the most fitting historical paradigm in Ryan's sense for such a Hispano-Christian conversion narrative, a supersessionistic gesture writ large in the multi-secular canvas of Jewish Heilgeschichte. The Christian intervention enacts the larger eschatological. This Christian intervention enacts the large-scale conversion of Jewish sacred history into the Christian salvation drama. But this is just an interpretive conjecture, a working hypothesis to gauge these Christian traces in the Israeli Codex that I should now open to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go to the next.
Thank you very much. Of course, I will respond basically to your written introduction to the Torah Shebiktav, and not to your oral lecture that if I had to respond, probably some of my doubts and criticism probably would change. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot begin my response without previously expressing my deep gratitude to Professor Don Luis Giron Negron for enabling me, as a non-specialist, to revisit the Bible of Rachel, or the Bible of Alba, as it is also called. Looking yesterday at the National Library of Jerusalem, the gorgeous facsimile edition published by the Fundación Amigos de Sefarad in 1992, I cannot but join Professor Giron's superlatives of being, I quote, a monumental work of Hispano-Jewish scholarship, a linguistic treasure trove for Ibero-Roman philologists, an exceedingly rare case of hybrid blend of Jewish and Christian visual motifs, of its exquisite illuminations, as well as an unparalleled collaborative effort to contrapuntally juxtapose Jewish and Christian materials. In fact, every scholar who studied the Bible of Rachel is literally bewitched by this superb masterpiece, and the result is always dithyrambic. Thus, after consulting the 1920s edition, Americo Castro identified in the Bible of Rachel the embodiment of his Jewish, Christian, and Muslim idea of Spanish convivencia. In 1967, Karl Otto Nordström argued that Rachel Bible should be considered as a sort of de facto postila for masterly including Christian and rabbinic biblical scholarship, thus following Nicholas of Lyra's past hermeneutical enterprise and Pablo de Santa Maria's contemporary ediciones, by increasing the need of rabbinical sources to understand the sacred scriptures, albeit this time through the intervention of a living professing Jew. In 2001, Sonia Felou followed Castro's views when she argued that Don Luis de Guzman confiait au rabbin, that is Moshe à Rachel, la réalisation d'une traduction qui rapproche juifs et chrétiens autour de l'Ancien Testament. At the same time, she endorses Nordstrom's views by claiming that the translator Moshe à Rachel aimed to satisfy both his Christian and Jewish readers without betraying his religious identity. Therefore, she inferred, the Bible of Rachel's translation, illuminations, and glosses are a manifesto for promoting a Judeo-Christian cultural rapprochement without entailing religious tolerance. Rabbi Moshe Rachel ipso facto showed that anyone can live in Iberia according to his faith, que chacun peut vivre selon sa foi, while admiring others' culture and religion. The problem is that these understandable states of scholarly wonder do not always properly perceive the very fact that such fascinating byproducts of acculturation, religious syncretism, or cultural hybridism are often obtained in context of neat asymmetric cultural hegemony and political dominance. I believe that a good example of that is precisely the gloss selected and translated by Professor Giron in which Rabbi Moshe Arachel's adaptation of Nachmanides' interpretation of Genesis 2:3 was imbricated with Friar Arias de Encina's Christian revision. You have here, it's one of the excerpts of Nachmanides' interpretation translated into English. Also, Professor Giron distributed that, but I only mentioned, not with crosses, but with bows and arrows, some of the divergences between the two. Personally, I do not believe that here we have a case in which the rabbi and the friar, I quote, provided in tandem competing claims about religious conversion and the eschatological hopes of both interlocutors, end of quote. Quite the contrary. A comparison between this gloss and Nachmanides' original commentary show that Christological themes were violently, abruptly introduced, thus displacing and deleting many of Nachmanides' Jewish messianic specific views. This was, I believe, an easy task to do. On the one hand, Nachmanides' biblical, typological, and allegorical biblical interpretations were deeply anchored in Christian hermeneutics, as showed Amos Bunkenstein a long time ago. On the other hand, the messianic trope elaborated here by Nachmanides on the 7th or 6th age of the world, following a periodization made upon the 6 days of creation and the sabbatical rest, was, as we heard, widely known among influential Christian interpreters and theologians, such as St. Augustine, being privileged by members of the Franciscan order to which belonged Friar Arias de Encina. Colleagues from these publics who are familiar with the Bible of Arachel scholarship could rightly argue that there are many other glosses in which a real Judeo-Christian rabbi-friar tandem existed. They may also remind scholars like Albert Sikhoff or Sonia Felou, who pointed out how usually Moshe Arachel privileges rabbinic over Christian interpretations. That said, I think that we should bear in mind two crucial aspects apparent in the prologues of the Arachel Bible: its condition of production and its peculiar language. Concerning the first point, let me quickly remind that Don Luis de Guzman commissioned the edition of the Bible to Moshe de Arachel, I quote, knowing and seeing and becoming informed about the biblical commentaries of your modern doctors, which Nicholas of Lyra neither obtained nor so, end of quotation. In front of Rabbi Arachel's initial hesitation to accept such a perilous task for a professing Jew, he was admonished to cooperate with menacing overtones. I quote, "It would be to your advantage to please us and not to anger us," end of quote. At the same time, Friar Arias de Encina fixes the rules of the game. Unless stated otherwise, he said, Rabbi Arachel will add Christian interpretations to his more frequent rabbinical explanations. Being reluctant to represent anthropomorphic images for theological reasons, the rabbi was requested by the friar to leave blank spaces to be illustrated according to mainly the latter iconographic directives. It is true that Friar Arias de Encina assured him liberty of expression, but he also lamented before his obdurate friend that he doesn't want to leave his mistaken tradition for the Christian truth. Rabbi Moshe Rachel answered to Friar Arias de Encina's prodigality was to be always prudent and respectful concerning Christian sensibilities. And this is particularly apparent in his particular linguistical choices. In this respect, Moshe Lazar celebrated a sui generis glossary of words, probably composed by Rabbi Arachel before the beginning of the Bible, as proof of his open-mindedness, aiming to find a common language through which both Christians and Jews could express synchronically their different theological standpoints and sensitivities. He opted for words such as catholica fe, to imply perfect or holy faith, Messias, for both Israel's anointed kings and Jesus Christ, Egleia, a synonym of community, Ostia, for both the temple's minchas sacrifice and the Eucharistic requirements, Antichristo, as also denoting the enemy of the Jews and of the Jewish Messiah, or martyr to Christian and Jewish saints antagonists. It is true that sometimes such polysemy enabled the rabbi to endorse discreetly some temporary ideas. However, I believe that most of the time, these words paved the way to reduce the gaps between Jewish and Christian theologies at the advantage of the latter. Out of prudence, respect, and sake for religious understanding, Rabbi Arachel unwillingly contributed to fulfill Nicolas de Lira's and Pablo de Santa Maria's own projects of Judeo-Christian continuities, but in an asymmetrical way, not by conferring a Christian value to Old Testament literality and to rabbinical interpretations, but by Christianizing Old Testament and rabbinical vocabularies. All that finally remind me the title of an article written by Jacob Taubes on Franz Rosenzweig Judeo-Christian Ecumenism he published in the 1950s, admitting the beauty and the noble intentions of the author of Der Stern der Erlösung, the Star of Redemption. Taubes reminded that the conflict between Judaism and Christianity must remain, I quote, an unresolvable difference, on the quote, for the sake of the relevance of both religions. Thank you.
Should I make a short comment, or should I? Oh, yes. I completely agree, as you may have gathered from my presentation. And part of the context for that text that I sent you again is that I was so delinquent in producing a description of the text for this Congress that I excerpted the first paragraph from a grant application to the ACLS. So many of the superlatives also reflected my effort to get some money, so I could spend an entire sabbatical working on this particular project. And obviously, I mean, in the context of the application, we were highlighting the significance of having Jewish Christian material set side by side. But the context of my presentation is precisely the asymmetrical nature of the presentation, and again, something we can discuss in some detail. I mean, now I will point out that despite the conditions in which the text was produced, it's quite remarkable Arayel's personal investment in the project. These are 8 years, 1422 to 1430, and there are many moments throughout the commentary when you realize that he also seized the opportunity to confront with certain diplomacy the conditions in which this particular project was entrusted to him. So he also challenged, I mean, many of the Christian collaborators with certain diplomacy. But I completely agree, and I thought that my presentation showcased that we were in tandem with this, and we'll get to discuss this more at length. But
Thank you.
thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Okay, so I'll also like to take the opportunity and thank Luis for bringing us this fascinating text that, as we've heard, is part of a very important project that all of us will, I'm sure all of us that deal with these subjects will use and benefit from. Okay, so now when I got the text and read it for the first and second time, I was mostly puzzled by Arachel's decision to provide his Christian clients with the typological interpretation of Nachmanides for the 7 days of creation. What good can come out of this in this situation from an interpretation which is clearly not literal and embodies an historical scheme that explicitly and even provocatively counters the Christian history of salvation? Moreover, the whole purpose of Nachmanides' interpretation, so at least I thought, was to support the Messianic calculation of the 6th age, and specifically to comfort and renew the confidence of a wide Jewish audience who expected redemption in 1240, based on another calculation that has now proven to be false. Okay, so it didn't came up until now, but the end of Nachmanides' typological explanation in his Sefer Geulah and also in his commentary to Bereshit ends with his Messianic calculation according to the book of Daniel that predicts that the 6th age will begin at the year of 3058. Okay, so, but of course, by the time of Arachel, the modified calculation of Nachmanides that indicated the year 1358 as the beginning of redemption was also proved to be false, and even became a tool in the hands of Christian polemicists, and particularly converts, and particularly Pablo de Santa Maria, who now I've learned was one of the people who inspired this project with his Additiones. And this is referring specifically to the Messianic calculation that Pablo turns in his polemical work into an indication that the Jews' Messianic calculation not only fails, but predicts events from the Christian history of salvation. The Maimonidean calculation, he turns out, as Pablo shows, that it in fact predicted the establishment of the mendicant orders, and in the case of Nachmanides, his failed calculation, Messianic calculation, predicted the beginning, the start of the fall of the Spanish Jewry that will end up with the mass conversion. So all of these ideas, and again, this is specifically about the Messianic calculation. Aside of that, Nachmanides at large and his esoteric traditions were used by Christian polemicists as the primal indication, the primal proof for that the Jewish traditions conceal Christians' truth. So all of that made me to think that it was a little bit odd to see it, and indeed, as the text shows, Nachmanides' historical division proved to be too much for his Christian supervisors that have Christianized it, even if in a very partial way that left us with a senseless and hybrid historical scheme that made no Christian or Jewish sense. Another thing in this text, and they obviously interfere, but it still isn't by any means a Christian, a kind of a paradigm that Christian can accept. The 5th age, which is the age of the church, is depicted as the age of persecution. So when is exactly the age of the church? When it goes to war? So there are a lot of problems in this scheme. So in fact, in a certain point, I even thought it's a kind of a hoax, because it's so far-fetched, especially because at the end there is this additional hint for a secret, which seems completely irrelevant in this case, which is one of the cases that the secrets are revealed. So it's not a hint anymore. This is the hidden meaning that Nachmanides gives, and that I will refer to. Okay, so I've decided to spend my 10 minutes in looking into how, and maybe even why, Arachel followed this source, that is Nachmanides. Now, of course, it was a risk, because I didn't know what Luis is going to address, if Luis is going to address these questions, which he did. But luckily, I still have a few points that I can add. Now, first of all, it should be noted that Nachmanides' commentaries on the Torah embodies a unique and very self-aware mixture of hermeneutical levels. When he has famously introduced into the genre of biblical commentaries the practice of Kabbalistic allusions, to which he often refers to as the path of the truth, al derech haemet, the vast majority of his commentaries are focused on the pshat, the literal sense, he is often criticizing the methods of his predecessors, and especially Rashi and Ibn Ezra. In his commentary to Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, that we have here, we can find all of these elements together. The first two paragraphs in Arachel's text, that again Luis already exposed and indicated which Jewish commentators they refer to, resemble at first glance the Jewish interpretations that Nachmanides also present in his commentary to the Torah. That is Rashi and then Saadia Gaon and Ibn Ezra. However, there are very important differences. First of all, Nachmanides paraphrases Rashi and Arachel, clearly goes to the original. But and I'll add another thing before we continue. It's more than a wonder. When I read the second paragraph, it seems to me I didn't recognize here Radak. It obviously begins with Ibn Ezra, goes to Saadia Gaon. And then it seemed to me like a very strange super commentary, and with a bit of Christian touch in it. First of all, I saw almost a complete parallel in the style of Nicolas de Lira. And second of all, even the terminology, the last sentence, I don't know, maybe you can shed further light on that. The last sentence of the second paragraph begins with the word no, which is, of course, your very elegant translation to fit the kind of rabbinic jargon that rabbis indeed are using. But in the Spanish it says considerar debemos, which I don't know, seems to me like more of a Latin or a Romance phrase than what we see in rabbinic interpretation.
Where is it exactly, this sentence?
The last sentence of the second paragraph, about the sanctification of the Sabbath.
Just before the parenthetical 3, if you see the number 3 next to it, is the sentence just before that number. And you have this, and you can find the Spanish as well using the numbers. So.
Okay, but what is more important is that Nachmanides presented both these opinions, or even three, with regard to Ibn Ezra. It's a little bit difficult to say what exactly does he mean, but in order to criticize them and reject them. With regard to Rashi, Nachmanides revealed that his explanation about the manna was taken from the Midrash, which Rashi himself never does, which means in this context that it cannot be considered a pshat like Rashi intended it. And as to the commentary of Rasag, of Saadia Gaon, Nachmanides states that the benediction cannot refer to a future event, and in this case, the laws of the Sabbath that weren't given yet. I would also note here that Pablo, who is a very close follower of Nachmanides, uses exactly these arguments by Nachmanides in order to contradict Lira, who uses the kind of opinions that we find in French rabbis and repeat them. Against these explanations that he rejected, Nachmanides provides his own opinion that introduces with the words, "the truth is." Now, Luis already explained and quoted this explanation about the Sabbath being the fountain of the blessing, so I won't repeat it in any way. It doesn't make much sense to people like me who are not admitted into these secrets. But the point is that he starts this interpretation with the word "the truth," which signifies that he's now going to an upper hermeneutical level. But evidently, at this point, Arachel is not interested in addressing this esoteric level of the text, and he sticks with the commentaries that Nachmanides rejected. It is only after he is faced with the Christian Trinitarian interpretation in passage 3 of our handout that he turned to the mystical readings of Nachmanides. And now I have, maybe what I'm going to say is completely flat out false. But with regard to the questions that you've raised about the origins of Arachel's interpretation, his rivaling interpretation of the Trinitarian explanation of the Christian. Now, the general scheme that Arachel presents of a threefold creation was already used by Jewish commentators who tried to deflect Christian claims that threefold repetition in scriptures allude to the Trinity. For example, the Jewish commentator and polemicist Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, made exactly this argument with regard to Isaiah 6, that reads, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, saying that it was sanctified 3 times, and quoting, against the 3 worlds. The upper, it is the world of the angels and souls; the middle world, that is the world of the wheels and the planets; and the lower world, it is this world. But in the case of Arachel, it seems to me that this explanation stems directly from Nachmanidian mystical traditions, and it begins in the argument that will eventually lead to the typological presentation of the 6 days of creation. In his interpretation to verse 1 of this chapter in Genesis, I am referring to this is Nachmanides, "Vayacholu hashamayim va'aretz v'kol tzeva'am," and the heavens and the earth were finished with all their multitudes. Nachmanides says that it is that in the plain sense, the multitude refers to the planets and the living creatures on earth. But he adds that on a higher hermeneutical level, it alludes to the making of the angels and the human souls in the work of creation in Maseh Bereshit. Rabbeinu Bechayei, from the school of Nachmanides' disciples, and as I learned from you, a commentator that Arachel knew and drew from, developed this idea and combined it with the scheme of the threefold creation. Now, okay, in the context of Bechayei, it appears as an apologetic explanation. Why does the story of creation does not specifically talk about the creation of the higher sphere of the sphere of the angels and then of the planets? And he gives an explanation because they, in order not to make misrepresentations of their very tight connections. So, okay, and so does Arachel's specific explanation that relates to the 3 different verbs, against the previous gave, Vayachol, Vayishbot, Vayishbot la'asot, to the 3 worlds of creation, appears to nourish from the higher level of meanings that Nachmanides exposes with regard to the verb to do, la'asot. When Nachmanides explained this expression, bara Elohim la'asot, he provided a grammatical explanation of the word la'asot, to do, saying that it forms together with bara, created, a single expression, bara la'asot, that is common to biblical syntax. But then he expands his interpretation, revealing the hidden meaning of to do. And here he begins this explanation with da, which signifies that here is one of the places that he reveals a secret. Not only gives allusions, as in the occasion we speak of the way of the truth, but here is one of the occasions that he reveals something that was hidden before that. So he begins with da, saying that it signifies the word la'asot, to do, the 6 days of creation. It signifies that the 6 days of creation unfolds all the history of the world. And from there, he begins his typological interpretation that Arachel follows, and that eventually the Christian editor changed. Thus, it seems to me that the last 3 passages of Arachel, the only one in which he refers to the mystical reading of Nachmanides, were designed as one coherent reply to the Christian argumentation. Okay, so this scheme of 7 ages, he provided it because it was integral to the Nachmanidian explanation of the creation of the lower world through the word la'asot. And as we can see in the text, the insistence about the word la'asot parallels exactly the kind of treatment that Nachmanides give the words la'asot when he transforms, when he goes from his grammatical explanation of la'asot into his typological explanation of the 7 ages. Okay, and of course, well, I've mentioned it earlier, there is one important omission that Arachel omits the messianic calculation itself in the end. Thus, while Arachel avoids, at least in this case, in the example that we have here, the grammatical and textual inquiries of Nachmanides, as well as his criticism of other Jewish commentators that were generally not known to Christian, he turned to use his esoteric, or at least his non-literal explanation, when they seemed fit to answer the Christian Christological readings. it's like the Christian raised the level of hermeneutic discussion while providing something that was clearly not a literal explanation, and in this case he draws on Nachmanides' mystical interpretation. In other words, he uses Nachmanides as a polemical source against Christianity, but even then he does not mention the existence of a Jewish secret. That is, he never says that Nachmanides' interpretation reflect an esoteric tradition. He just gives them. And of course, he doesn't mention also Nachmanides' failed messianic calculation. This is why I saw so peculiar this last words of the text that says, "Keep yourself all this that has been said, for it is undoubtedly a secret," which again makes no sense in a written form, which just said what the secret is and is now copied and given to a Franciscan supervisor. So it raises other questions. So that's it. Thank you very much.
I'm sure some of you cannot withhold their comments any longer. So please feel free to comment on all three papers, on the text. Raise your hands and we'll try and create a sequence or an order. Oh.
Someone has to begin. Two questions. First of all, is there a way from the material book to know something about its creation? Many questions to ask: who wrote, who did it? Is there a way to look at the material itself, the materiality of the answer? And the second one goes to Yossi. Are we sure that it was Ariel that chose Nachmanides? Maybe it was imposed on them by the Christian in order that they can use it in order to answer the Jewish way of thinking about the sequence of
I didn't quite get it. What did you say?
Can we be sure that the choice of Nachmanides was done by the Jew himself? Perhaps it was imposed on him by the friars, someone, because they knew the power of Nachmanides and within Jewish circles, and in order to be refuted in the sequence of writing.
Let me first address your second question because it relates to one of the many wonderful points that you brought up in your response. I don't think the friars imposed Nachmanides on him. Those friars were not the brightest light bulbs in the world. They were not, I mean, Fray Arias de Encina has some biblical literacy, but certainly the range of learning on Christian materials was not compatible to what Ariel's on the Jewish side. And I would have been surprised if either Arias or Zamora would have been aware of Nachmanides' Nachmanides' reputation. I mean, there are other Christians who may have certain knowledge, but at least in terms of the people that we know who were involved, the two friars, and the third one, by the way, I mean, Arias de Encina was Luis de Guzman's cousin. He was a relative, someone he could rely upon. He was a teacher of Bible at a Franciscan convent in Toledo. And yes, I mean, he had enough knowledge to provide all this, but by and large, at least in looking at the Christian materials, many of them could have been extracted from late medieval florilegia of patristic sources. They don't seem to reflect a deep engagement with the better traditions of Christian exegetical scholarship. So, I mean, given their deficiencies on the Christian side, could they have imposed Nachmanides? I would be surprised. I don't want to rule it out, but I would have been a little bit surprised. We can discuss that. I mean, by the way, I mean, yes.
I have without being a specialist like most of these gentlemen, I have a personal interpretation. First, even if you could be right, we have again to remind that this topos of the Sixth Age, it's a card of presentation for any Franciscan friar. In other words, you don't have to be an erudite in order to expose, because this is the hardcore of Franciscanism. And this we know not only through this one, but looking at Alain Millou's studies on Franciscanism during the Christopher Columbus time, and so on and so forth. Then first I will suggest that it was an expectation that Moshe de Rachel will provide somehow this merchandise. And what I try to say, maybe against the opinion of the specialists, is that Rachel played the game. He played the game. That is, they demanded him more or less, go, you have to play with our rules. And Moshe de Rachel, it seems to me, at least in this case, he agreed with that. And therefore, I will suggest, again, without being a philologist and so on and so forth, that probably this was composed not after, a posteriori, but during, because this is the hardcore of Franciscan historiosophical thinking.
Let me just make a comment on that connected to your take on Nachmanides before I get to your first question about the material production. I was also puzzled by the reference to secret at the end of the gloss, and it appears in other glosses throughout. Yes. A few times connected to Nachmanides, other times I have no sense of where the claim to secrecy comes from. Now, he used Nachmanides throughout the commentary. I mean, he figures, he names him. I mean, he talks about Moshe Nachman de Bar. I mean, he mentions him from Gerona. He mentions him throughout the text. Now, there is one interesting example that comes to mind of Arrayel's more complex use of Nachmanides in relating to his Christian interlocutors. In his commentary on Genesis 38:8, about when Onan failed to fulfill his conjugal responsibilities and was killed. The gloss is a very lengthy gloss, and I will need also some. I mean, I actually wrote to Moshe Idel about this at one point. I still haven't heard from him, so I'll have to go and knock at his door. Arrayel says, Don Luis de Guzman, and he mentions him by name. According to some, this is a Kabbalistic secret. Now, and he says, I mean, it's a secret of the Mekubal. And he says, and he is transcribed, I mean, in Spanish. And he says, I mean, why did Onan, I mean, what is the esoteric meaning of of Onan's failure to fulfill his conjugal responsibilities? He says, well, Nachmanides says it's a secret. And it's a reference to Ibur and Gilgul. I mean, he basically says that the main problem in failing to fulfill his duties towards Levirate marriage is because by not having intercourse with Tamar, he was preventing the soul of his dead brother from re-entering the world of the living. And he has this very extensive discussion on some of the Kabbalistic symbology connected to the idea, to this esoteric interpretation of Levirate marriage. And he says, this is what the Kabbalist says, Don Luis. And then at the end, as far as I'm concerned, yo no me trago nada de esto. And that's a literal quote. I don't swallow any of this. It doesn't make any sense philosophically or theologically. It is a mystery to me. Now, why is this significant? He is indulging in a very elaborate Kabbalistic reflection on Gilgul based on Nachmanides' hint. For the benefit of Luis de Guzman, this obviously flew above his head. The type of discussion that could have been used by Christian anti-Jewish polemicists to characterize the irrationality of contemporary Jews. Kabbalistic ideas were used in a number, in Jewish-Christian polemical debates. So at least in that case, he didn't inhibit himself from using Nachmanides as a template to introduce this elaborate discussion. And moreover, he alerted Luis de Guzman to intra-Jewish debates over the significance, because he says, that's what the Kabbalist says, and he goes, it's a very long gloss, and then I don't believe any of this. It's not philosophically tenable. So, I mean, he uses Nachmanides in a variety of ways throughout the text. Now, I'm actually fascinated by the prospect that this is indeed, the fifth one is a synthesis of Nachmanides' mystical reading of Genesis 2-3. Now, it would imply that Arrayel had enough of a grasp of that particular text to do this synthetic abstraction in responding to the Christian gloss, and I'll have to look back at this. But yes, I mean, he uses Nachmanides in a variety of ways throughout the commentary, as well as sometimes more deliberately in trying to provoke Don Luis, other times because particular interpretations may have proven suitable to his purpose at hand. That's enough for that. Now, about your first question, and I have something to say about Pablo as well, but I'll leave that for later. About your first question, we know a lot about the creation of the Codex. Especially my dear friend Gema Venosa in Barcelona has this wonderful monograph, Las Biblias Castellanas Medievales, which is basically a codicological analysis of all of the Old Spanish romanciamientos. And she does what good codicologists do. I mean, I love hanging out with codicologists. I mean, it takes a certain stamina forma mentis. I mean, it's very but I love, I mean, when they talk about binions and ternions and quaternions and so many choirs, and you know that they are grasping with the material artifact that make this available to us, so I'm deeply grateful. And there is a lot that we can gauge about the way in which the codex was put together. I mean, the way in which certain choirs reflect the materials that Arrayel sent, the things that were given to him to add, the place where the illustrations were added, the spacing to incorporate the glosses. We have a lot of it. There are still questions. Some of the questions that I've raised derive from parsing the content of the glosses as they found their way into the final product. But yes, we can tell a lot about the production. I mean, she described therein, if you're curious, every single choir that is put together in the 515 folia of this text. I mean, choir by choir. Indeed, much more information than you will ever need. But again, so we know, I mean, and it's significant because it reflects, she has some conjectures. I mean, who was responsible? I mean, which were the scribes involved? Who were the illustrators? We have different hands. I mean, we can actually tell how many hands were involved in producing different sections of the text. There are some issues that we haven't resolved yet. So, for example, Esther, we have no commentary. It's the only book, and we are almost certain that Arrayel produced one. But somehow it didn't find its way into the final codex, which is a pity because the illustrations, I mean, of Megillah Esther are fascinating for a number of reasons. Yeah. So, I mean, indeed, there are times when, for example, in the binding of Isaac, we can tell, when I was first editing this, I realized that most of the glosses seem to be out of order. I mean, that somehow they did not follow the sequence of verses in the Genesis chapter, and I was a little bit intrigued. And then I talked to Gema, and she had, I mean, a moment of genius. Oh, but look at it. Basically, whoever put this together excerpted all of the glosses related to the illustration and left the more abstract ones for the other page of the folio, which is fantastic. I mean, there is so we can see that the people involved were attentive, I mean, to detail and to the whole. That Arrayel makes reference to the illustrations in some glosses, which suggests that he was aware, despite his scruples over the inclusion of illustrations, he was aware, I mean, of the process. I mean, he makes reference to the illustration of Noah's Ark, which looks like an ovni. I mean, it's wonderful. So we have a lot of information. Despite that, we still have questions to ask about the content, because many aspects of the content cannot be simply solved by the codicological analysis of the text.
Okay. Yossi, Maurice Giron, Chaim, and Brian. That would be the order.
Two questions, really. I don't know what's your take on that, but another two issues that I think comes up when looking at this entire project is why do you think they chose to go to a Jew in an era when we have so many conflicts available? What do you think that it means about their willingness to let the convert deal with these materials? What do you think it means about their, I don't know, do you have any take about that? And the second thing is, why do you think the project eventually wasn't disseminated in a substantial way? Why didn't this treasure of Jewish literature was used much more extensively than it was?
Wonderful questions for which I can only conjecture. About the first, well, I mean, why a Jew and not a converso? Well, we have quite a sizable body of all Spanish translations of Hebrew works that were commissioned by Christian noblemen and produced by either Jews or conversos. And I don't know if there is a rule determining why they choose one over the other. So for example, the oldest vernacular translation of Moreja Nebuchim in an European vernacular, aside from Latin, is Pedro de Toledo's Old Spanish text, at the behest of another Christian aristocrat. Now, we don't, I mean, I suspect that he was a converso, he could have been a Jew or a converso. It's not clear from his self-presentation in the text. We have an abridged translation, I mean, of Halevi's Sefer HaKusari. We have translations of Ibn Ezra's scientific work. In most of the situations, usually we find Christian aristocrats, which for a variety of ideological purposes, recognized that Jewish scholars and or conversos had a particular expertise in at least three areas where they were concerned: Bible, philosophy, and science. And so they found scholars which had some kind of reputation and commissioned the creation of this text. Now, some of these texts may reflect an intra-Jewish tradition of translation, but at least the materials which are extant were produced in the context of Christian commissions. In the case of Moshe Arayel, most likely he chose him because he may have consulted with his relative by marriage, Marqués de Santillana, Íñigo López de Mendoza, one of the great Spanish poets of the 15th century, an unusual character, I mean, a great poet. I mean, he was not a professional scholar, but had a range of cultural interests, had one of the most impressive libraries that we have documented from the 15th century. His library preserved, for example, Pedro de Toledo's Enseñador. So, I mean, most likely he may have consulted, I mean, as Antillana or someone like him. Do you have a recommendation on someone who could take on this particular project? And we know, I mean, because Arayel moved from Guadalajara to Maqueda, that he moved from one of the territories under Santillana's care to a territory where he was in charge. So, I mean, there is at least the possibility that he contacted someone and looked for a recommendation. I think there is not a particular rule of thumb, except for the expectation that they could find someone with the linguistic and scholarly competence to produce this particular text.
Sure.
Yes.
May I have an additional answer?
Please.
And this probably, again, with all the caveats, yeah?
Yes.
Additional answer stems from a term who appears again and again in Moshe Arayel, but also in his interlocutor, is the term of nación, nation. And both Arayel and his interlocutors, they look at Jews and Christians as a nación. But look at that, nación is not conceived by none of them as ethnic particularity, but as a kind of correspondence between your ancestral origin and your religion and culture. That is, if you wanted to elaborate on the Hebraica Veritas, what could be more ideal than to to find a person who embodies the Jewish nation, that is, he's both coming from the Jews, but is also a professing Jew. That this is a kind of, I will say, a prisca theologia sort of Iberian humanistic aim to precisely found a professing Jew and not a conversion.
Prisca theologia with legs.
Yeah.
No, I mean, and again, I mean, this is one. I mean, I mentioned the case of Santillana because he was certainly very deliberate in contacting Jewish scholars, in particular, to meet a variety of needs. When he, for example, produced the Carta Proemio to a collection of his own poetry delivered to El Condestable de Portugal, he mentions in the text, or I mean by name, he was aware of Jewish scholars who were distinct embodiments of particular types of learning. Shem Tov de Giron, Shem Tov ibn al-Dutiel is mentioned explicitly by Santillana and praised as a great trovador and poeta. So I mean, there is certainly, I mean, an awareness, I mean, of what the presence of learned Jews in their court signified, and he may have brought, I mean, that perception of the prisca theologia as the context for asking, I mean, and keeping in mind, he's one of many. Most of the, I forgot now the exact number, of the 16, 17, 20 extant codices with biblical translations, we have at least 11 fragments representing 8 different translations made directly from Hebrew. So obviously there was, I mean, and these are the ones that survived. So obviously there was, I mean, a number, I mean, of Christian scholars contacting Jews who had the learning, who had the possibility of satisfying this particular need for access to the Veritas Hebraica. And we'll see that that continues partly into the 16th century under the Conversos. Now we are, for example, celebrating the 5th centennial of the Complutensian Polyglot Bible, which was prepared between 1514 and 1517. And part of the wonder of that particular creation is that Cardenal Cisneros found 3 Converso Hebraics who had the expertise in Hispano-Jewish biblical philology to produce not only an edition of the Hebrew text, but the ancillary tools for Christian students at Alcalá de Henares who wanted to learn on their own biblical Hebrew. The grammar, the glossary is quite remarkable. I mean, so there is already an awareness, I mean, of, living embodiment, I mean, of the tradition or vehicles for its transmission at the dawn of Christian Hebraic scholarship in the 16th century. So it makes perfect sense. And your second question about why it didn't produce a larger impact, again, that's quite a mystery. I mean, as far as I can tell, I mean, I've been trying to see if we can document traces of the Arrayel Bible. Lope García de Salazar, a Basque scholar, has, I mean, this particular text, Bienaventuranzas y Fortunas, and it includes, he regurgitates verbatim portions of Arrayel's translation. Now, most likely, given what we know about the codex, he may have had access not to the codex itself, but perhaps to the quires produced by Arrayel, which may have been, I mean, and again, this is purely conjectural. I mean, given, if we, I mean, it's the only source that we have along with the Arrayel Codex to work on an edition. I think that perhaps part of the reason why it didn't have an impact is because of what happened to the Codex itself. Luis de Guzman makes this commission. If you open the facsimile or the Codex, you will see that there is this wonderful illustration of the moment when Arrayel is presenting the final product to Luis de Guzman. It's a spectacular illustration. Luis de Guzman dressed up with the red cross of the Cistercians, which was the emblem of the Order of Calatrava. You find this entire court, you find the Arias del Sina, Zamora, you find this depiction of the 14 acts of mercy, and Arrayel is on his knee presenting, the manuscript. Now, that never happened. It's an illustration of what should have happened but never happened. Luis de Guzman was embroiled in one of the civil wars between Castilians and Aragonese. He may have died before he could see the final product. So we surmise that the codex just entered the library of the Order of Calatrava, and for that very reason it didn't circulate. I mean, as far as we know, we don't have any documentation of copies that would have made his deeply learned commentary widely known.
Segments?
So far we haven't found, except, I mean, until the 17th century, the only documented reader of the Arrayel Bible we have is Lope Garcia de Salazar. And as far as we can survive of the translation, not of the comments, something may appear. It's one of the mysteries surrounding this text. What happened to it in the 16th century? I mean, because at the end of the 15th century, it was in Isabel la Católica's personal library. And then it's gone. And it reappears in 1608, 1609, when this Jesuit scholar asked permission, no, this Carmelite scholar asked permission to look at the codex because he was working on a commentary of the Song of Songs. And then a Carmelite friar also wants to look at it. And then the relative of the inquisitor says, I want to read it, but he starts reading, this is too hard, I cannot understand this, and he gives it back. Literally, I mean, he complained that it was too hard and too dense. And then finally, I mean, another inquisitor realizes, I mean, that this is in the hands of this Jesuit, and he says, please bring it back to me, and he offers it as a gift to a man who married into the Alba family, and that's how it, I mean, how it survived. What happened in the 16th century? What happened in the 15th century? We don't know. We don't have any evidence that it was read, which is one of the motivations, I mean, to devote so much energy and time to the edition. I mean, it's wonderful after 500 years to recuperate the voice of this man. Right now, we only have, and you mentioned, there is only one part, I mean, there is one transcription of the glosses that was produced by Paz Inelia, who was the librarian of the Alba, I mean, of the Alba patrimony between 1920 and 1922 to celebrate the, I mean, the fourth centennial of the, I mean, presumably the fourth centennial of the production of this, but only 200 copies, no annotations, a lot of mistakes. It was a noble effort, but besides that, I mean, the glosses has been barely studied. So.
Okay, so this has been a great session so far, and it's a fantastic start to the conference. You mentioned, Yossi first of all mentioned the use of Nachmanides, or the secret interpretations of Nachmanides when it's useful. We know that it's interesting that in the Nachmanidean school, already in the 14th century, there are examples of when Christians and Jews interact, using secret interpretations in order to answer, in order to confound the Christian interpretation. And that brings me on to, in the 14th century, and you mentioned Ryan, to the place of Avnei of Burgos in this whole scenario, because if you look in Avnei of Burgos' work, there are thousands of citations from the Bible translated into Castilian. In fact, there are places where you get full chapters, and does that play at all into this?
And that will allow me also to connect to something else you mentioned. Yes, Abner de Burgos figures here. We have found at least a couple of Christian interpretations that originate in Abner de Burgos' extant works. And indeed, there are some materials of a polemical nature that may be indebted to Abner or parallel sources. One of my many homeworks in the years, I mean in the months to come, is I have a laundry list of Christian addenda that I want to send down Ryan's way to see. I mean, it takes, again, a particular stamina, because he's the sweetest man on the face of the earth. And you have to be sweet and kind to devote so much energy to such poisonous texts and survive. So I mean, I take off my hat to Ryan. I mean, it's a testament to his kindness that he can actually deal with this text. But yes, there are many references to Abner de Burgos, or at least a couple that are recognizable. There are sometimes references to Alfón de Valladolid, or Maestre Alfón, which we are surmising maybe Alfonso, even though in some of the explicit references to Maestre Alfón, we have not located them as yet in Abner de Burgos' extant works, and other addenda that are not identified by source are documented therein. So yes, there is certainly an awareness on the part of the Christian contributors of Christian polemical materials produced by conversos that were also added into the repertoire of Christian materials. And going back to Lira, because you also, I mean, you pointed out that Lira, that part of one of the glosses is very close to Lira's postila. One of the, another assignment that I have to make to myself is to look more systematically at the parallelisms between his glosses and Lira and Pablo de Santa Maria. Now, in Genesis, there is one extensive gloss where Arrayel deals explicitly with the issue of Nicholas of Lira, which is trying to explain Metzahek. I mean, when Ishmael was Metzahek with his brother Isaac, I mean, was he playing with him or was he mocking him? And there he goes, I mean, and Arrayel has this extensive gloss where he first reviews Nicholas of Lira's use of Rashi in that quote. And then he offers two alternative commentaries. One of them, I think, was Nachmanides, and the other one was Gersonides. And the one from Gersonides is close to Pablo de Santa Maria's critique of Lira's postula. Well, it's one of the places where he expressly worked with Lira, and also show awareness of some of the responses against Lira's take on the. So one of the things that I have to do is to be more systematic, and this is I mean, it's a 10-year project, so I hope I have enough time and energy and health to do this, put this together. But Arrayel and the Christian collaborators both had access to a range of Christian materials and apologetic sources that are reflected in the glosses we have edited so far.
Yes, a general question about beyond the specific source.
Could you speak louder, please?
About the nature of the translation into Spanish by Arrayel of the Bible text. There is the Ferrara Bible, middle of the 16th century, and there is a discussion, if I'm not mistaken, whether this mid-16th century still reflects a tradition of an oral translation by Jews before the expulsion in the old teaching among Jews of the Bible. Is there in Arrayel's translation some trace of something that would lead to the Ferrara Bible, or that is linked to, and from that we would see that indeed there was a Spanish translation that was with big diffusion among Spanish Jews?
Well, thanks for the question, because it's also a wonderful opportunity to introduce what my friend Andrés Enrique Arias has been doing with this Bible. I don't know if any of you have taken a look at a website called Biblia Medieval, which is produced by Andrés Enrique Arias. He's a historical linguist, a professor at the University of the Balearic Islands. And it basically has a range of materials for people interested in the Old Spanish Bibles, including all of the Old Spanish Bibles online. And so basically, if you go to that page, you can, for example, say you want to check Isaiah 4:4. It shows all the extant Old Spanish translations of that verse, next to the Hebrew, to the Latin Vulgate, to transcription. And if you touch any of the paleographic renderings, it shows you an image of the codex, so you can compare the codex to his transcription. And he's adding also the Ferrara Bible as part of, as one of the possible comparanda. Now, one of the issues that we face in editing the text, and one of the things we have to address, is how does Arrayel approaches the question of biblical translation, and where does he position himself between two possible poles? One pole is the one that is in many ways embodied by the Ferrara Bible, which is trying to render the ipsissima verba of the Hebrew scripture down to its minutest morphosyntactic wrinkle because of a profound commitment to the offline significance of the Hebrew Bible in its entirety. Now, Ferrara in many ways represents one of the most robust examples of a systematic effort to translate everything, even the accusative particle et, which become a. I mean, this is one pole. And then the other pole, more periphrastic renderings of the Hebrew Bible at sensum, not at literal, and moreover, sometimes even inflected by Jewish exegetical commentaries. Most of the old Spanish Bibles are somewhere in between, some closer to the Ferrara model, but not as systematic as the Ferrara Bible is. Arrayel is on the other pole. Even though it's a balance between faithful but periphrastic at sensum. He doesn't feel obliged to translate what is perceived as a redundancy in the Hebrew text. Moreover, he's more than happy to incorporate exegetical materials into the fabric of the translation. I mean, I was looking at again, I have plenty of examples, but a discussion with Jacob hears that Joseph is alive, and he kinds of faints, no? Or I mean, I forgot. And he has this entire, and he says, y se detuvo el corazón por la calentura dental que parecía como si estuviera muerto. And his heart stopped, and because of the flow of the heat, because he looked as if he were dead. It's taken almost verbatim from Nachmanides' medical explanation of what happened to Jacob. And that's inserted in the body of the translation. Sometimes there are certain lexical choices that are closer to the Ladino Bibles. In the, again, I could, later I can show you examples. I don't want to detain you with some of the philological minutiae, but when he did in the Onan verse, for example, the word acuñadar, to become someone's in-law. That's actually a count based on the Hebrew form of the verb in Genesis. But on the other hand, the euphemism for go into, ba'el, which most of the other Bibles translate literally, entrar en, venir en, he actually renders it beautifully with the Old Spanish avolver, avuélvete con ella, which is advolvere, and is la more used, no? It's the perfect word. So there is a certain balancing act between exquisite translations of the sensus literalis and more periphrastic gestures inflected by exegetical interpretations. So in Arrayel's case, it represents, I mean, maybe the most extreme among those on the opposite side of the Ferrara Bible. Now, there are certain linguistic predilections in the Old Spanish Bibles that survive in the Judeo-Spanish Koine that is reflected in Ferrara. And indeed, one of the things we've been doing, part of the challenge in preparing this edition is, obviously, we have Spanish philologists who work intensely on the Old Spanish Bibles but don't know Hebrew, and Jewish scholars who may have a wonderful interest in these materials but don't know Spanish. So basically, we ended up 3 Spaniards and 1 Puerto Rican doing all the annotations in English for the sake of that. So one of the things we had to decide how to explain, and usually I'm the one who is working with the Hebrew and the Spanish. Basically, my 2 colleagues, Andres and Javier, they are phenomenal philologists. They don't know Hebrew. Angel and I were working on the Hebrew, and I do work on Spanish. And now with Angel's passing, I'll have a lot of. I'm such a wonderful man. So what we basically did, and we've been looking at the Ferrara Bible systematically, because it's the most interesting comparandum to showcase what Arrayel does. We usually put the Arrayel text, basically in my office I have, at home, I have Arrayel, I have, the Hebrew Bible, I have the Septuagint, I have my Latin Vulgate, I have my Aramaic Targumim, I have Sa'adia for good measure because of Septimus, and then of course I have Andres page with all the Old Spanish Bibles, and I have the Ferrara text, and then when we put the Arrayel translation, we use either of 2 English texts for the sake of the Spaniards who don't know Hebrew, either the JPS translation, which may be the most perhaps a scholarly translation specifically for Jewish audience, and the King James Bible, because the King James Bible is a miracle. I mean, I've never studied, I mean, I come from it. I grew up with the Spanish Bible. I didn't grow up with the English Bible. It's the first time that I realized what a miracle in an effort to sustain a balance between faithfulness and beauty. And it's the most useful to explain to those who don't know Hebrew what's happening in the Hebrew text. And then we put all the comparanda from all of these wonderful Bibles. And Ferrara usually provides one extreme against which to test what Arrayel does. So, I mean, there may be some continuities between the Old Spanish translation and the Ladino Bibles, but they represent different, in this case in particular, different translation models.
Last question.
Yes, I have.
Sorry. 5 more minutes. Yeah, Reiner and
briefly. Thank you very much, President Wong. I had many questions which mostly answered, but there is one question left, and I want to reconnect the whole thing, so to say, to a so-called 611. I was asking myself if the whole book, the whole commentary on the Bible, was only, we would call it maybe today a collection or recollection of scholarship, and you have it then and you put it on your shelf, or if from the very beginning there was also an audience in mind. And if there was an audience in mind, I was also asking myself which audience was in mind. It was for a broader audience, for a Christian audience, for a Jewish audience. So to say, why do you do such a book?
Well, why to do such a book? Well, he had enough time in his hands to do it. Yes, I think he had multiple audiences in mind. Obviously, there is the basic context. The Christian aristocrat who commissioned this, and as Claude was pointing out, I mean, in a very asymmetrical context where he had little choice but to comply. Although, I mean, there is a certain drama created in the prologue about the way in which this is produced. He is aware of Luis de Guzman's route. There are many direct apostrophes to Luis de Guzman. There are glosses where he says, and by the way, there are different type of, specifically glosses on areas where he thinks that Luis de Guzman will be particularly interested or perturbed. So he has Luis in mind throughout, and I mean, references to him appear throughout the entire commentary. I think he also has at least a Jewish audience in his head, whether or not the commentary would actually have been read eventually by Jewish readers. But he's fully aware, I mean, of his co-religionaries in the way in which he presents, debates, and structures the presentation of his materials. He has predilections. He has, I mean, because one of the questions that I was asking myself, is this simply a cento? Is this simply, well, let me just choose 4 typical explanations, lump them together and go to the next? In which case, it's basically just picking from his library to satisfy Louis' curiosity. But there is, in some of the glosses, there is an intellectual coherence to the way they are put together that suggests that he's also thinking as a Jewish scholar, which have very specific predilections within the range of hermeneutic options that his contemporaries face in interpreting the Hebrew Bible. So he's in dialogue with other Jews as he organizes in his mind which glosses to select, which ones to omit, and the way that he presents them. Sadly, again, as I pointed out, we don't have any evidence of who actually read it, except for these rare cases. But I mean, we do have multiple audiences in mind. I mean, I don't think the fact that he devoted so much time and energy suggests that despite the conditions for this commission, he took it very seriously. He took it to heart. He invested time, energy, and thought, and that he was not simply doing, I mean, he was pleasing his patron, but he had other readers in mind that are sometimes acknowledged throughout the text. When he discusses, for example, I mean, the Shevet Yehuda, I mean, there he has a very extensive note where he says, look, and fellow Jews think this, and Christians think that, and I'll have to explain as best I can what is, I mean, some of the Jewish positions on this, and then Arias will present his materials, and there he's more explicit than usual about the fact that there is a broader Jewish community to which he feels accountable in explaining this, the glosses that the interpretation that he incorporated in that gloss. So, he has, both audiences in mind. Now, I spent the past 3 years just trying to come up with a protocol for the edition along with my colleagues, and we have studied in depth the prologue and Genesis. Now, what happens when I get to Exodus, I'll tell you 3 years from now if we have a
Yes, I have one last comment, which in a way continues Reiner's question about the translation. It strikes me how many translations into the vernacular were made in Spain in this period, and even a bit later if you take into account also Cisneros' project of the Alcalá Bible. Well, it's interesting that they don't translate into Latin, they translate into the vernacular for a certain audience that would read the vernacular, the Spanish of those days, and not the Latin. And it strikes me also because I encountered a very small example of such thinking in a completely different direction. It was an attempt, at least, to translate the Yosifon into Castilian, which is also very interesting because it happened a little bit later than the period of the Rachel Bible. And I think it shows the same way of thinking, that you want to address a non-Jewish audience, you need to do it in the vernacular. And I will finish with something that one of Nebrija's colleagues said. Nebrija is trying in vain to teach Latin to the Spanish. It's almost like preaching Jesus to the Jews or something. I'm not sure that I quote accurately, but that's more or less what he said.
Well, let me say, to put this in context, they did not translate into Latin because they had a Latin translation. They had Giron. Keeping in mind, at this point at least.
But not the glosses.
Huh?
But not the glosses.
Not the glosses. We have of the extant Bibles, we have 2 fragments, Escorial 6 and Escorial 8, which are pre-Alphonsine from the early 1200s, done from the Vulgate. Then the General Historia by Alfonso X includes almost a full translation of the Vulgate Old Testament into Spanish, which is in the General Historia. When in the 16th century we find the first efforts to look closely at the Vulgate and propose other Latin translations, it created a number of issues that are central to the intellectual history of the 16th century. For example, when Fray Luis de León was in prison on December 1571 over his involvement, among other things, his involvement with Hebrew philology in his own, he produced a Spanish translation of the Song of Songs at the behest of his cousin Isabel Osorio. He ends up in jail, and I was looking at this fragment of the inquisitorial process about his translation of Einayis Yonin Miba'at Le Samatech in Song of Songs 4:3. Now, how did he translate that? He explains that in the Vulgate, Giron, for reasons that I failed to understand, he thought that it was a reference to the sexual parts of a woman. The word appears, Samat appears in Song of Songs 4:1, 4:3, I think 6:5, and Isaiah 47:2. And in his commentary on Isaiah, he says that it's Verecundia Mulieribus, the shameful parts of a woman. The Septuagint translates Sama as Siopesi, silence, and the Greek fathers have a field day with that. Now, in medieval Hebrew, medieval Jewish scholars says, Sama is something that covers the eye of the beloved. So it's either a veil, somet, or else hair. Fray Luis, when he translated tus ojos de paloma detrás de tus guedejas, those eyes behind your hairlocks. And then he wrote in his commentary, according to Giron, Giron translated it with an euphemism, absque eo quod intrinsecus late, that which lies hidden within. And then Fray Luis writes, according to Giron, it means something hidden. He didn't have the heart to tell his cousin the nun what Giron thought that it actually meant. But according to those more learned in Hebrew, aquellos más doctos en esa lengua, it means hair. Then when he gets in prison, he writes this wonderful text, where he's enraged with the Inquisition, and he says, you're going to tell me that the Holy Spirit was more brutish in Hebrew, that Symmachos in Greek, or Giron in Latin, since that part of the body has name in all these languages, and you're telling me that Solomon raised her hair and then her eyes, and then he skipped the rest of her body driven by some lustful instinct? Not even Ovid there to name it so brazenly in his text. And if it is actually what Giron thought it meant, if it's a reference to the sexual parts of the woman, and the fathers of the church teach that the beloved in the Song of Songs is an allegory of the church, what is the allegorical sama of the church? What is the allegorical And then he has, of course, the humanist clincher at the end. Even if it meant what Giron thought, it also means hair, because words can have more than one meaning, so what makes more sense in context? Now this is, of course, he actually got out of the inquisitorial jail after almost 5 years, and we have the famous leg that he comes back to Salamanca, and Dicébanos externa di, as we were saying yesterday. Now, that kind of question, one of the questions, the issues that I ask myself, but I haven't studied, is whether in the 15th century, the scholars who look at the Vulgate, whether their voice explicitly the kinds of concerns that Godfrey Ruiz de León into hot waters in the 16th century. Arrayel addresses that in his commentaries. He's aware of issues in Giron, and he says that. One of the examples I gave you in the handout, he says, I translated this is how Giron understood. He's diplomatic enough not to simply say more explicitly, Giron got it wrong. The Yossi Font is a wonderful example, actually. My friend Gemma Venosa is very interested. She was going to organize a project on the Yossi Font translation.
I know, I was in contact with her.
Yes, she was in contact with me as well. We have to talk about this then. But I have spoken too much and I have abused your patience, so thank you for forbearing me.
Thank you.